And now, in celebration of the fact that we are here and in person, amazing, I want to ask for you to take a moment to greet each other. I do want you to honor the color codes to make sure that if someone is more comfortable with a fist bump or an elbow nudge than a hug, we respect that. And unfortunately, you might have all seen I have had a slight injury that prevents me from going up these stairs fast. So I may not come and greet you all in person, but I will send you my love from here. So please take a moment and say hi.
Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again, come. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again, come.
When Olympia Brown was little, girls weren't supposed to whistle. Girls weren't supposed to climb trees or run fast or catch frogs, but Olympia did. She did all those things and more. You can do whatever a boy can do, her mother and her father told her, and Olympia knew it was true. She climbed trees and ran fast and caught frogs, and when she was in school, she answered the teacher's questions loud and clear. Little girls ought to be quiet, said one lady in town. Little girls ought not to make themselves heard. But Olympia did. She had a voice, and she was going to use it every day. When Olympia Brown was a teenager, young women weren't supposed to go to college. Young women weren't supposed to leave home to go off and learn complicated things. But Olympia did. She did all those things and more. Olympia left home and went to Antioch College. She went to class and studied and learned all kinds of complicated things. Young women ought not to be in college, said one professor at that school. But since they are here, they must read their reports. Young women ought not to give speeches from memory like the men. But Olympia did. When it was her turn to present her report, she rolled up the papers in her hand and said each and every word loud and clear. Olympia Brown had a voice, and she was going to use it every day. When Olympia Brown was in college, women weren't supposed to wear pants. Women weren't supposed to wear anything except very long dresses that came all the way down to their toes. But Olympia did. She wore dresses that came down only past her knees, and under them she dared to wear pants. Bloomers, the pants were called, after Amelia Bloomer, the woman who'd created them a few years before. Women ought not to show their ankles in public, exclaimed some of the men, and women certainly ought not to wear pants. But Olympia did. She wore her bloomers every day, no matter how much the men sneered.
When Olympia was finished with college, women weren't supposed to be ministers. Women never stood up in front of congregations and talked about God. But Olympia did. She did all those things and more. Olympia graduated from the Theological School of St. Lawrence University in 1863, and she was ordained as a Universalist minister in June of that year. The second woman ever to be officially ordained by that church. She became the Reverend Olympia Brown. Women ought not to speak in public, said a minister at that time. Women ought not to take the pulpit or discuss the nature of God. But the Reverend Olympia Brown did. During the next 35 years, she was a minister in 5 different congregations. And she visited other congregations too. She took the pulpit in every single one, and she spoke on the nature of God and love, and she did an excellent job. Olympia Brown had a voice, and she used it every day. When Olympia Brown was born, women weren't allowed to vote. Women weren't allowed to have any say in who was elected president or senator or mayor of the town. But Olympia had something to say about that. Olympia had a lot to say about that. She traveled all over the state of Kansas in a horse and buggy, giving speeches to convince people that women deserve the right to vote. She wrote hundreds of letters. She spoke to the representatives and senators in Congress. She marched in parades. Olympia and her friends worked very hard to get women the right to vote. Olympia Brown had a voice, and she used it every day for over 50 years. And finally, when Olympia Brown was old, women were allowed to vote. In November of 1920, when Olympia was 85 years old, she voted for the very first time. Olympia always had a voice, and she'd used it to make sure that she and all of the other women in the United States had a vote as well.
This morning, our offering is going to go toward a directed source. We're going to share it in full with the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee and their emergency relief effort for Ukraine. And today, to ask for the offering, Harlow Robinson will do that. Harlow has a special connection with Ukraine. Some of you were here last Sunday for his excellent discussion and talk on the war there and some of the reasons, complexities leading up to it. So Harlow, thank you so much for doing this today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Well, I'm sure, like me, many of you have been watching with shock and horror what's been going on in Ukraine and the suffering of so many millions of people, and especially the children and families. And I think we all have a feeling of some helplessness, what we can do about this. And of course, giving money is one of the best things we can do. There are other things too, and I'm sure you're all exploring various options. But today the offering is going to the UU Service Committee, as Tara said, for emergency relief for Ukraine. And, you know, I thought for the offertory this morning, what I would do is read a poem by the most famous Ukrainian poet. His name is Taras Shevchenko. And he was quite an amazing fellow. He was born a serf. He was born into a family of slaves, basically, when serfdom was still the law in Russia, which was true until the 1860s. In fact, it was abolished just around the same time as slavery in this country, early 1860s. So he was born a serf, although later freed. And he was an incredible creative artist, best known as a poet probably, but also a very accomplished painter. And the main university in Kiev is named after him, the Shevchenko University, along with lots of other place names and monuments all around Ukraine. In fact, they've sandbagged the big monument to Shevchenko in Kiev because he always was a representative of Ukrainian independence. In 1847, he was politically convicted by the Russian Tsarist administration that was under Nicholas I for writing in the Ukrainian language. That was a crime under Russian rule, writing in the Ukrainian language, and promoting the independence of Ukraine and ridiculing the members of the Russian imperial house. So he was actually jailed. And he was sort of in and out of prison for most of his life. He died in 1861. So he's a great sort of martyr to the cause of Ukrainian independence then and today. And here's a poem of his that I think particularly states love for Ukraine, patriotism. When I am dead, bury me in my beloved Ukraine, my tomb upon a grave mound high above the spreading plain, so that the fields, the boundless steppes, the Dnieper's plunging shore, my eyes could see, my ears could hear the mighty river roar. When from Ukraine the Dnieper bears into the deep blue sea the blood of foes, then will I leave these hills and fertile fields. I'll leave them all and fly away to the abode of God. And then I'll pray. But until that day, I know nothing of God. O bury me, then rise ye up and break your heavy chains, and water with the tyrant's blood the freedom you have gained. And in the great new family, the family of the free, with softly spoken kindly word, remember also me. And that poem was called Testament. So the offering will now be received.
It will. And could two people get the offering plates in the back and invite people to give as they are able? Thank you.
Jenny's afraid of water. I mean, she swims so well, but still, she's afraid of water. So she won't go near the sea. Not me. Katie's afraid of darkness. I mean, she sleeps on all, but still, she's afraid of darkness. So when the lights are out, she has to hold my hand. I don't understand. I'm not afraid of anything, be it mountains, water, dragons, dark, or sky. I'm not afraid of anything. Tell me, where's the challenge if you never try? So watch me fly. I'm not afraid. Daddy's afraid of babies. I mean, he got through me, but now he's afraid of babies. I guess he's scared of what they'll be. Not me. Mama's afraid of crying. I know she tries to hold it in, but she's afraid of crying. And she can look at me with tears stuck in her eyes, and I don't know why. I'm not afraid of anything, be it growing old or going out of style. I'm not afraid of anything. Who would give up what they want without a try? Another mile. I'm not afraid. And I feel the calling of adventure are glaring, trumpets blaring, I'm right here. And I hear the calling of tomorrow, and I feel the stirring in my bones, and someone loves me. They're afraid to hold me. Listen to the calling of excitement. Can you feel the pounding of my heart? The lights are ready, pulse is steady, I can start. Never stop the calling of the challenge, blessing of the water and the stones, and someone loves me. They're afraid to tell me that someone loves me. Are they afraid to trust me? Are they afraid to hold me? Will they always be? Are they afraid of me? And I'm not afraid of anyone. I am sure to win with anyone at all. I'm not afraid of anyone. Not a soul alive can get behind this wall. So let them call and watch them fall. 'Cause after all, I'm not afraid.
And as we continue to turn into this moment of gratitude for this church community that has held us so well, especially over the last few years, through this uncertain time, through these moments when we have certainly at one time or another felt afraid, and we've been able to gather and remind ourselves that, yes, we can take a breath and move through our lives and into the world with renewed courage. As we offer gratitude for this particular religious home that has welcomed women-identified voices since its very founding in 1886. As we hold gratitude for this community that does its best to love and care for Earth and all of Earth's beings, we hold in our hearts that spirit of thankfulness as we say together the words of thanks for our offering, and those are in your order of service. For the ministries of the church and our community, we bless our offering with love and hope. I invite you to take a breath in together and to gently exhale. If you haven't already fully landed here in your pew and in this space, now is a good time to let yourself do that. And each week we renew our commitment to care for the well-being of all life by saying together the words of our promise to our planet. Please say that with me. As members of the family of living beings on Earth, we are guided by the Unitarian Universalist principle of respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, with hearts filled with love for it, eyes nurtured by its beauty, and minds ruminating on ways to protect its sacred and scarce resources. We promise to nurture the well-being of all life and of the planet itself.
I was blessed to be born to a mom that decided when we were born she was going to stay at home. She told me once that before I left her house, I would know how to cook, I would know how to clean, I would know how to iron my own clothing. She wanted me to represent her and her family and her accomplishments. At the time, being a stay-at-home mom might not have had the glamour, but she felt it was the most important thing that she could do in her life. She instilled values and beliefs in me that guide me still today. And yes, I do know how to do all of those things. I did leave home. And while I know not everyone has a mom still around, or even a mother figure that gave them those same ideals, may we all be blessed by someone in our lives that has taken an interest in us, that has made us feel cared for, that has been interested in who we are and what we do.
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of courage and fathers of time. We are daughters of dust and the sons of great visions. We're sisters of mercy and brothers of love. We are lovers of life and the builders of nations, seekers of truth and keepers of faith. We are makers of peace and the wisdom of ages. We are our grandmother's prayers, and we are our grandfather's dreamings. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are, who we are.
In 1970, women ministers made up about 7% of all ministers into the Unitarian Universalist Association. In 1994, that number increased to 30%. In 2017, almost half of all ministers were women. As of right now, our Unitarian Universalist faith is led by more than 65% women. This is a relatively large increase in a relatively short period of time. Our current president, Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, the first elected female leader of the Unitarian Universalist Association, credits, in part, to the General Assembly of 1970 that called for more women to serve in ministry and policy-making roles. However, as these numbers may look like we are making great strides towards inclusion, and we are, it's not the whole story. You see, the vast majority of women ministers are white. And while women ministers now outnumber men, the vast majority of the larger congregations are still the domain of male ministers. Let me be clear, our liberal faith has made great strides of including women in all roles of our faith tradition. And we come from a long line of women ministers in the lineage of Unitarians and Universalists. Women ministers that have broken amazing barriers in becoming ordained, particularly in their time in history. In the late 1800s, a majority of the Unitarian Universalist ministers, Unitarians and Universalist ministers, were women. Though ordained, very few of them actually served as full-time ministers. Those that did served very small and often struggling congregations, or were relegated to assistant minister positions beside their husbands. In resistance to this, one female minister, Julia Ward Howe, organized a group of 21 women to serve churches in the Great Plains. They were called collectively the Iowa Sisterhood. The women took on harsh conditions and risks to themselves to bring a more pastoral approach to preaching in the West. There were severe hardships to the early American settlers who were suffering and made this maternalistic approach very appealing. According to UUA documentation, quote, the success of the Iowa Sisterhood was the non-academic, pastoral approach that these women brought to their churches. They sought to make their churches extensions of the domestic hearth, thereby expanding the traditional role of women beyond the home and into the church. That, and of course, because the male ministers, who were more scholarly, educated in the East, were not really attracted to these harsh conditions and didn't want to go. Many of the sisterhood were eventually rushed into retirement and replaced by male ministers. In fact, during the Great Depression, the vast majority of female ministers were forced out of the ministry when jobs became scarce. Many church members of these congregations actually began to oppose the female ministers that had been part of their lives because there were perfectly good men that could take these roles. This is a familiar theme that many women went through that were faith leaders facing in this time of history. However, I think acknowledging what was happening during this time makes the accomplishments of these women even more poignant. Take, for example, Antoinette Brown Blackwell. She was born in 1825. In addition to being a dedicated women's rights activist, she was also credited as being the first American woman to be ordained as a minister by a congregation. Nettie, as she preferred to be called, when she was a child, attended at age 8 a service. It was at her regular congregation, but there was a guest priest there at the time who basically said, everybody in attendance should give their lives to God. This moved Nettie. She promptly called and told everybody in the attendance, I am going to become a minister. Though she was told by almost everyone that girls couldn't be ministers, her mother understood, saw this passion in her, and pinned a little small white ribbon onto her collar to give her as a reminder that her goal, though faced by opposition at every step of the way, was hers. She went to college. She obtained a degree in literature and then applied to that same school's theology department. Though it was a women's college, and she was actually admitted to the theology school, she was reminded constantly that said the Bible did not approve of women speaking in church. She completed her theological studies and was denied a degree. It was 2 decades later that she was actually awarded her degrees. She was called to preach in both Congregational and Unitarian churches. She was first ordained into the Congregational church by a Methodist minister because the Congregational minister wouldn't do it. Antoinette married and had 5 children, one of which, Florence, became a Methodist minister. After the Civil War, Antoinette decided that she wanted to dedicate her time towards caring to her children while lecturing on women's rights and writing articles for many different publications. Her last position as a minister was the founding of the Unitarian Society of Elizabeth, New Jersey, where she was elected minister emeritus. And then there was Lucia Fidelia Woodley Gillette, or Fidelia, born in 1827. She was the first woman ordained to Universalist ministries in the United States. There's evidence she was likely the first female minister to preach in Canada as well. She spent her childhood traveling in a circuit with her father, who was also a Universalist minister. She became so enamored by the concept of universalism, she spent her early teens and adult years writing about it, educating herself. She also wrote poems. She campaigned for women's suffrages. She also was a voracious learner. She studied algebra, geometry, French, astronomy, and botany, in addition to teaching herself religion. But as was fairly common in the first half of the 19th century, Universalist ministers didn't always have formal theological training, but were rather mentored by current ministers. This was the case with Fidelia. Though she petitioned the Michigan Universalist Convention to be provided with a license to preach, she was approved the following day. She continued to preach and speak at suffragette conferences, and she would provide the prayer. She was asked to provide the opening prayer for the Michigan House of Representatives, and later took an offer as a half-time preaching assistant for the Universalist Society in Michigan, where she was finally ordained in 1876. She took her time. She took care of her family. She did what she called Unitarian missionary work. She continued to be requested to preach in multiple services, in multiple churches, and then in 1887, 10 years after being ordained, she was called to replace a retiring minister at Bloomfield, Ontario Church, where she was giving a salary of a full $500 a year. Then there was someone named, and it might sound familiar based on today's service, Olympia Brown. Born in 1835, she was the first woman to not only graduate college, bestowed with formal degrees, but also the first graduate of an established theological school, the St. Lawrence Seminary. Further, she was an ordained Universalist minister, the first woman to achieve that full ministerial standing by a recognized denomination. When she went to seek for her theological degree, she was first rejected by multiple colleges, one even a Unitarian school. She stated that the trustees thought it would be too great of an experiment to admit a woman. Once she completed her degree and she had a call to the Universalist Church in Bridgeport, Connecticut, she arrived and found a congregation that was in a shambles. They had even considered closing the church after she had been called to preach there. She stayed, and after marrying, despite the objections from her mother, because her mother says, "Don't do it, it'll interfere with your ministry," she became pregnant. And during maternity leave, despite having been called to serve by this congregation and having served that congregation, a vocal minority called for her resignation. Olympia put it, quote, "My parish gave me a vote of endorsement passed by a large majority." These enemies continued, calling in ministers from neighboring churches, promulgating this doctrine: what you need here is a good man. She spent the rest of her life in these types of churches, though, in addition to becoming a prominent figure for the suffragette movement. In one of her last sermons in the fall of 1920, she testified how important universalism was, and I quote, "the faith in which we have lived, for which we have worked and which has bound us together as a church. Dear friends, stand by this faith. Work for it. Sacrifice for it. There is nothing in all the world so important to you as to be loyal to this faith, which has placed before you the loftiest ideal, which has comforted you in sorrow, strengthened you for the noble duty, and made the world beautiful for you. While writing this sermon and reading the history of many, many Unitarian Universalist women ministers, I thought, do you think that our current principles would have even been considered then? The inherent worth and dignity of all people? Or the acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations during these times? And although we are fortunate enough to be based in a faith tradition that had these amazing women as our leaders, and that we have amazing women leaders now, have we truly come that far from the statement for that ministry that we need a good man? Could we not benefit from female ministers of color, from trans women ministers, whose life stories and amazing skills could be so sorely needed and celebrated in our pulpits? And is it worth taking the time to remember where we've come from so we can clearly see where we need to go to next? Amen, and blessed be.
If every person in the world had their mind set on freedom, if every person in the world dreamed a sweet dream of peace, if every person in the nation, young and old, each generation held their hands out in the name of love, there would be no more war. If every person in the world had their mind set on freedom, if every person stood with their brothers as a witness of peace, if every person in the nation, young and old, each generation held their hands out in the name of love, there would be no more war. If every leader in the world shared a vision of freedom, if every leader in the world shared a sweet dream of peace, if every leader of every nation reached in friendship and liberation, holding hands out in the name of love, there would be no more war. If every nation in the world set a true course for freedom, if every nation raised its children in a culture of peace, if all our sons and all our daughters reached in friendship across the waters, refusing to be enemies, there would be no more war. If every person in the world had their mind set on freedom, if every person in the world shared a sweet dream of peace, if every person in this nation, young and old,
Although our chalice is extinguished, we carry its light within us. May we recognize the flames within each other and use them to illuminate our paths forward and to be a beacon of light for one another. Go now in peace, love, and light. Amen.
These are the women who throughout the decades have helped us to know where we have come from and where we are going. The women who've helped us to grow, standing before us, making us strong, lending their wisdom to help us along, sharing a vision, sharing a dream, touching our thoughts, touching our lives like a deep flowing stream. These are the women who joined in the struggle, angry and gentle and wise. These are the women who called us to action, who called us to open our eyes, standing before us, making us strong, lending their wisdom to help us along, sharing a vision, sharing a dream, touching our thoughts, touching our lives like a deep flowing stream. These are the women who nurtured our spirits, the ones on whom we can depend. These are the women who give us their courage, our mentors, our sisters, our friends, standing before us, making us strong, lending their wisdom to help us along, sharing a vision, sharing a dream, touching our thoughts, touching our lives like a deep flowing stream. These are a few of the women who led us. We know there have been many more. We name but a few, but we honor them all. Those women who went on before, standing before us, making us strong, lending their wisdom to help us along, sharing a vision, sharing a dream, touching our thoughts, touching our lives like a deep flowing stream. Amen.
Thank you, everybody.
whole fun here. Yeah, the poem is beautiful. I was like, oh, wait a second, that's who the university's named after. I had no idea he was a poet. Oh, because like I've seen the name around, and I'm like.